History is really just a story we tell ourselves. But what happens when a major chapter in that story, especially the story of our global economy, has been wrong for centuries? Well, today, we're digging into a forgotten economic boom that completely reshaped the world, long before most historians ever thought it did.
So let me ask you this. When did our interconnected, global economy really kick off? You probably have a few famous dates in mind, but the evidence we're about to walk through suggests the real story starts way, way earlier than the textbooks say. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the forgotten boom itself, then look at the desert gold rush that started it all. We'll cover the tragic army of slaves that powered it, a brand new textile economy, the global merchants who connected everything, and finally, what the real revolution was all about. Okay, Section 1, a forgotten boom. For hundreds of years, the story everyone believed was that after the Roman Empire fell, the Red Sea basically became an economic ghost town, just a quiet, sleepy region waiting for something to happen. So the old, accepted timeline goes a little something like this. Starting in the late 6th century, the economy was, well, muted. Things stayed pretty quiet for hundreds of years, then, bam. Around 969 AD, the Fatimid dynasty comes to power in Egypt, and the economy suddenly bursts into life. That's been the standard story for a long, long time. But what if that story is off by over 100 years? What if the real economic revolution didn't bother waiting for the Fatimids to show up? Well, that's the new argument, and honestly, the evidence is pretty incredible. And that brings us right to Section 2, the Desert Gold Rush. This is where the new story really kicks off, not with some slow, gradual revival, but with the raw, explosive wealth of a massive gold rush. Take a look at this map. This is the Wadi al-Alaki region, way out in the Sudanese desert. Sometime in the 9th century, Arab prospectors rediscovered ancient gold mines here, and it kicked off a frenzy that pulled in people from all over the known world. The scale of this operation was just staggering. I want you to look at this number, 60,000. That's how many camels and donkeys they estimate were needed just to haul supplies to the mines from the nearest city. That doesn't even count the ships. This was a colossal undertaking. And we're not talking about a few dusty mining camps. A writer at the time described the main settlement as a great town, a bustling international city that just popped up out of the desert, packed with markets and merchants, all of it built on gold. But, this boom was built on a truly dark foundation. Section 3, an army of slaves. This incredible growth we're talking about was fueled by a brutal and rapidly expanding trade in human lives. The demand for enslaved people was really coming from two main places. First, the gold mines needed a huge and tragically expendable workforce, and at the same time, newly independent rulers in Egypt and Yemen were building these massive armies, and they overwhelmingly relied on African slave soldiers to fill the ranks.
This quote from the historian Al-Makrizi, it's just chilling. He describes a notorious slave raider whose man captured so many people that a human being became the price for something as simple as a haircut. It just shows you how completely devalued human life had become in this economy.
And this chart here, showing the makeup of the Tulanid army in Egypt, really drives home the military scale of this trade. You can see the African infantry, made up mostly of slave soldiers, vastly outnumbered the more elite Turkish cavalry. They were, quite literally, the backbone of these new military powers. So we have gold and we have the slave trade. But the third pillar of this forgotten boom was something you might not see coming. Textiles. Section 4 is all about weaving a new economy and this fascinating idea of the draped universe. So what in the world is a draped universe? Well, it was a massive cultural shift in how people decorated their homes. The old style of heavy wooden furniture, like you'd see with the Greeks and Romans, gave way to an Arabian style that was all about fabrics. So think cushions, curtains, carpets, tapestries. This one shift created an absolutely enormous new domestic market. And Egypt became the absolute epicenter of this new industry. A 10th century writer described factories churning out an incredible variety of goods. Not just clothes, but everything from curtains and fancy brocades to massive decorative tents and pavilions. This wasn't some small-time cottage industry. This was a cornerstone of the entire economy. All right, so we've got wealth from gold, labor from the slave trade, and a huge domestic textile market. The final piece of the puzzle was reconnecting the Red Sea to the rest of the world. That brings us to Section 5, the global merchants. And the key players here were this totally fascinating group of Jewish merchants
known as the Radhanites. They were likely from around Baghdad, and these guys were true globetrotters. They were multilingual, incredibly sophisticated traders who managed to reestablish ancient trade routes connecting pretty much the entire known world.
A geographer at the time described them with this one simple but honestly perfect line. They travel from the east to the west and from the west to the east. They were the threads that were weaving together a new global economy.
And you can actually trace their incredible route right here. They traveled all the way from Europe, crossed overland to the Red Sea, and then sailed east to India and China, bringing back luxury goods like musk and cinnamon. All of a sudden, the Red Sea wasn't a backwater anymore. No way. It was the critical artery of a revived global trade network. And this was all happening in the mid-800s.
Which brings us to our final section, the real revolution. Okay, we have the four pillars, the gold rush, the slave trade, the textile boom, and the global merchants. But what was the spark? Why did all of this ignite so fast, a full century ahead of schedule? Well, the answer, it turns out, was migration. This wasn't some slow, organic growth. This was a revolution, and it was sparked by the arrival of a new merchant class. As things got worse over in Iraq and Iran, these entrepreneurs and investors packed up and moved west, and they brought their money, their expertise, and their aggressive business culture with them.
So this slide really pulls it all together. You've got the four economic pillars we've been talking about, but the engine driving the whole thing was what one historian has called a bourgeois revolution from the East. It was the arrival of a new capitalist way of thinking that saw opportunity everywhere and completely transformed the Red Sea.
And that leaves us with one final thought. This entire 9th century economic boom was essentially lost to history, just overshadowed by stuff that happened later. It really makes you wonder, if a revolution that reshaped a huge part of the world could be missed for so long, what else are we missing? What other crucial turning points are still just out there waiting to be rediscovered?